potholes.
It's actually not a quote from me, it's somebody at Time Magazine who did me the great favor of putting that in story went viral and, my Get Out of Your Mind, Into Your Life hit 20 on the Amazon list, so thank you, publicists. But really, what's inside this approach is the idea that the way that we pursue life satisfaction, meaning, etc., is off, that we're looking at our emotional cognitive content too close in time to be a good measure, and we are tended by our problem-solving mind into doing logical, reasonable, sensible, and pathological things that undermine our ability, not just for mental health, but for performance, stepping up to the challenges of physical disease, diet, sleep, exercise, all just everything goes wrong when we handle that pursuit of happiness incorrectly.
So you're saying that happiness is more than just pleasurable experiences and positive emotions.
Yeah, I'm pretty much with the Greeks in terms of eudaimonia. If you're really doing what you deeply care about and value, along that journey is going to be happy, sad, joy, mad, all the things that happen along the journey. And it's going to be a powerful, meaningful, happy journey. But happy in the sense of the satisfaction of a life well lived and of knowing that you love and make a difference in the world.
So, among the ancient Stoics, the idea of there being honor in suffering or something in suffering that is not all bad, the ability to show character during suffering was something that used to be admired. But now, if you suffer, you're a loser because circumstances went against you. And of course, we admire rags to riches stories or the person who overcomes suffering, but there's a survivorship bias there. So, what can the person in the middle of suffering do, or even the person who has suffered, who is unlikely to ever get their name on the front page of the newspaper, to do with their suffering? Let's say it's a trauma in childhood, a marriage separation, business that's failed. What good can there possibly be in these objectively awful things?
Massive good. And if you just follow individuals' lives, you'll see, and think about your own life, you'll see that the things that are really meaningful and that, pivoted your life often were the sour, difficult moments, the failures, the betrayals, where you learned a lot. And if you're open to what life will teach you in those painful moments, that it has several things to teach you. For one thing, it teaches you what you really care about because you hurt where you care. And so if you, rather than think of it just sometimes stoic, the way people think about it, sounds like tolerance, resignation, is that I would say there's information in suffering that is very useful to you. And there's one, it really, really helps to know what you care about. You mentioned trauma. If you've been traumatized as a child through emotional or physical or sexual abuse, boy, you know how important that is. And you just look at people who then dedicate their lives to children or to protecting those who are, downtrodden or, weak, lower on the hierarchy. Where did that come from? It came from the wisdom of suffering. There's other things as well, because you will learn more about how to navigate your life. You get your feelers sensitized if you don't downregulate the suffering at the cost of your capacity to feel. You become more sensitive in a way to life's ups and downs and to the possibility. I'll give an example. If you've been, let's say, the subject of a sexual attack, horribly traumatized, and it came inside a relationship that was just starting, but you thought you trusted that person, and yeah, the next time out, you want to be able to have your sensors out, your spidey sense, to be able to say that, something's off here. This is not quite right. I'm not going home with that guy. And where does that come from? It comes from your emotions, from your felt sense. Your mind's not good enough at parsing it, but your gut sense, your intuition is. But if you dampen that down, but I'm not going to feel bad, guess what? You become less able and more likely to navigate it, more likely to be abused again, which is a tragedy. And I'm not blaming the victim. I'm just saying, let's give people the skills they need to become wise from the ups and downs.
So, this skills approach to impacting our mental health, and at Resilience Agenda, we're big on trying to find ways to share these skills with people before they have that trauma, before they have a problem, and before they need to go to therapy. And we use the mental fitness approach. And I think one of the things that people say is, well, I'll be happy when my problems go away. We often say this to ourselves, or I'll be all right when X, Y, Z. But when you think about it, we're always going to have problems. And if we've had difficult moments in our past, presumably we're always going to have those memories unless we deeply suppress them. If we didn't have any problems, we probably wouldn't have anything to motivate us and life would be incredibly dull. It's just that we don't want these problems, the ones that we have now. We'd prefer other problems. What's wrong with this type of thinking, and how or what attitude can we take to the problems that we haven't yet encountered, so that we can experience them, so that we are less likely to end up in the therapist chair?
Well, the mind is a problem-solving organ, and the problem isn't the problems. The problem is that it's the same old stinky problems. Time for some new problems. We might call them challenges or aspirations, and so the things that you're led into that problem-solving mindset is get rid of, subtract, eliminate, and a lot of the things that you do out of that space ends up actually perpetuating, building, refocusing, making even more attention on it. If you're trying not to think of a past failure, let's say, and so you're thinking of something else, yeah, but now the something else will remind you of the thing you're not supposed to be thinking about. And now you've created another neurobiological groove to even more thoughts about that thing. And so, what I think what we need to do is learn these skills. But the problem is, and it's one and every parent has faced, you may have learned a lot from your life journey, and it's likely going to be in these areas we're going to talk about, these flexibility skills. But when you just tell people this is what you learn, which is what you should know, and they're not ready, it's not relevant, in one ear out the other. So the trick is to find the little problems that you've got or the problems that you have if they're big, apply solutions that will pay off in other situations. In other words, learn the core skills, the flexibility skills that will then be there when it's another challenge, another problem, because they're coming down the road. People are going to die. People are going to betray you. You're going to have failures. You're going to become old. You're going to have diseases. These things are going to happen to you. And if you train your resilience skills when you need them, they'll be there in these bigger and bigger challenges that may be down the road. And there's really good data on that. And we think we know. I mean, I've spent 40 years studying it, trying to get the smallest set of resilience skills that do the most things. And I think I actually have the evidence in a study I just released that we have achieved that. And it's only 6 things. And if you learn them, you can add a lot of other stuff, but these are the core ones.
Let's get to those things in a moment. But I want to go back a step. And this, for some people, if our psychologist listeners might enjoy this next question, feel free to skip ahead by a minute or two if this is of no interest to you. But if you can try and make this answer as relevant to the layman as you can. One of the frontline treatments for treating anxiety or depression these days is cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, changing the beliefs, the truth of the thoughts that we have. And this is, considered very much the front line of therapy and treatment these days. Very much, we advocate some of this approach in our reframing approach, of course. But there's also a difference between that approach, which some people might call the Albert Ellis ABC approach, and your approach, which is called ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy. Whereas rather than trying to argue with the thoughts, you're trying to have a different relationship with them. Can you briefly explain the difference between those two lines of thinking and why you think acceptance and commitment therapy is something that's made your research so valuable?
Yeah, the models that were there, and ACT, the way we don't say ACT, but ACT is part of CBT. It's part of that tradition, but it's the newer wave of it. The problem with those older models is they didn't plan out and research. And what happens when you're doing these kinds of reframing, et cetera, is that at their best, and the reason why they work to the degree that they do, is that they create greater cognitive flexibility. Instead of just thinking this one thing, I can think many things. And then given that, which ones do I want to put my life's moments into? Now, if you get into the detect, challenge, dispute, and change, classic, Albert Ellis, he was a friend of mine and a wonderful man. But his theory, just that part of the theory, detect, challenge, dispute, and change, is just wrong. It's empirically wrong. That's not how his methods work. Never mind other methods. And so if you're going to focus on cognitive flexibility, being able to think and reframe and reappraise, the best way to do that is to step back a little bit so that you can see the thought. Don't take it so seriously. Just recognize it as a thought. That's in Beck and Ellis. And then respectfully decline your mind's invitation to just be dominated by that thought, but allow yourself to think other ones. That stepping back and noticing is in the classics. It was initially called distancing. What that was Beck's term. But what ACT did, and the first name for it was long, long ago, it's 40 years old, but long ago was comprehensive distancing. But it sounded dissociative, and we came up with ACT, a lot better term. But that stepping back and noticing, kind of in a mindful way, thus mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, all the new things that are coming, gives you the space in which to allow yourself to think many different thoughts. You're never going to get your cognitive ecology all cleaned up. You've got thoughts inside you that are prejudiced, that are narrow-minded, that you know are irrational. They're going to go to your grave. You don't. There's no delete button in the nervous system that's healthy. And so if you ever thought a thought, it's there in your memory at least, even if you've forgotten it. Why? Because you could relearn it again later. We know that. So instead of trying to change the form, change its function. And that's the turn that happened in newer forms of CBT, not just with ACT, but mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, DBT, metacognitive therapy, and on it goes. So when you do the careful research on processes of change, then you can see, yeah, classic CBT is helpful, but it's not helpful for the reasons they thought 30 years ago. It's helpful for reasons that now open up a whole bunch of other things you could do. Like you could take that difficult thought, instead of challenging it, sing it, see what happens. Sing it very slowly, see what happens. There's a lot of things you could do other than necessarily hammering on it logically.
That's a great answer. We want to go through some of these skills in a moment. First of all, talk us briefly through the 100-year history of psychology, from Freud and psychoanalysis to behaviorism in the middle of the century, to a more cognitive approach, to the positive psychology approach, and I guess the meta approaches that we have today. Can you just run us briefly through what has changed, what each one added or better explained than the previous one, and where psychology sits today in terms of not just your research and views, but in general, in explaining how we can better manage these mental illnesses or these languishes that appear to be growing in the world?
Well, that's an awesome question and a dangerous one. You asked a full professor to hold forth, and you're now in serious trouble. I'll try to keep it very brief. But, what Freud did is he opened up a kind of a open-eyed examination of the world within, which was a huge step forward inside the suppressive culture that existed at the time. And then the more relationship-oriented work, the Rogerian work and so forth, added the importance of acceptance in the relationship itself and maybe internalizing that. The behaviorists came along and said, hey, we got these learning principles mostly from non-human animals. That was a problem, but maybe we could apply those. Sure enough, you could. And the things they learned how to do still apply to this day in terms of exposure, skills, acquisition, and things of that kind. But we knew it wasn't enough. You still had to really understand cognition. What is it? Emotion. What is it? Attention. What is it? And so the cognitive behavior therapy wave started by asking your clients what they think, what they feel, sort them into categories, see if we can target them directly. But that wasn't based on a basic understanding of cognition and emotion. It was drawn from what clients say in psychotherapy. What's happened in the latest wave is that behavior therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, now has led to this so-called third wave, in which we begin to look from the form to its function, which was there in the early days. And we've been able to add, especially in the ACT wing, because it's based on a really elaborated theory of cognition that has several hundred studies behind it, and that can do things like teach language in kids who don't have it, or establish a sense of self in kids that are on the spectrum, and so forth. And so here we now, with just a maturing of our field, the world with is important, relationship is important, these core things of acceptance and values and so forth are important, but we need principles and processes. Animal learning's not enough. Just going to the clinic and kind of asking people about their cognition is not enough. What is? That's where we are now. It's just for the progress of a field. And fortunately, where it's led us right now is we don't have to care so much about all the little schools and wings. I don't really care if you use the words act or that. I'm not, that's what I'm about is what are the smallest set of processes that we can use to ameliorate problems and promote prosperity in people? And you want to call it act, that's great. But let's take what science has given us at that level and apply it ideographically, in other words, individually to your life, not just these normative categories of I have this disorder or that disorder. Oh, please. That's not paid off. And even the folks who created it are running in the other direction from it because they know it. Let's focus on what are the skills you need to produce the kind of outcomes that you want in your life. And I think we're finally ready after a 100-year journey to be able to answer that question.
Wonderful. One more question before we get to the role of thinking and how we can think better about our lives. What about things like breathing and sleep and movement and these sorts of things? I had a guest on last week who said when we send someone in for therapy, we send them to the psychologist who doesn't bother asking about their sleep, who doesn't ask them about their lifestyle and their exercise, and it's all very disjointed. Before we go on to really going into these thinking components, which are very interesting and also very valuable because most of us spend our lives thinking. We experience the world through our thoughts, and so therefore that gives us a lot to work with. Where does the latest science around, say, the gut microbiome or sleep or breathing fit into what you've learned and discovered over 40 years?
Yeah, that's also a great question and one that's on the leading edge of kind of where we are. I disagree with the person who said they don't ask about sleep. I ask about this in my workshops and I say, 20 years ago, did you? And nobody did. And I say, now, do you ask about diet, sleep, and exercise? And everybody raises their hands. Now, it is probably true that they don't have a good system as to how to integrate that into what they're doing at the psychological level. We've gone through an era in which the psychological level, had to be focused on and its dimensions understood. And so it isn't just cognition, it's affect and attention and motivation and sense of self and overt behavior, all of these things together, the whole organism interacting with the history and the current context. Yeah, but the current context is also sociocultural. And boy, are we facing that right now with the diversity, equity, and inclusion kinds of challenges that we see right in front of us and that we know we have to step up to. And so you do have to think about what are the couples and families and communities and cultures in which people are embedded. But then it isn't just the whole organism behaving. You've got all kinds of subparts to you. So what is the vagal system doing? What is actually going on when you're not sleeping, for example, in terms of your ability to even manage at the neurobiological level the challenges that you face. And then you pointed out that it isn't even just the subcomponents of the organism. You've got more cells in your body that are not human than are human. And that is really at the cutting edge of poop transplants and digging into the gut biome. So where we are, I think, as a gradual development of science adequate to the challenge of the human condition, is that we have multidimensional, multi-level interacting networks that need to be thought of as how do we evolve a complex system. And that includes the psychological level, the sociocultural, the biophysiological, but it also even includes the fact that you're an ecosystem. You've got foreign entities that are tickling your brain saying, feed me for a particular carb that you are not really wanting to put in your body because it only leads to being overweight. But that particular bacteria in your gut really wants that stuff. So that's a much more complex system to think of. It has to be analyzed not in these group design or randomized trials. It has to be analyzed by high density examination of the individual evolving over time, and that's a challenge. But we're up to it. We're on to it, and we have a lot of things we can say to the community right now about what we've learned so far. And also a lot of things that we know are coming down the pike as we shift the focus to these kinds of things.
Sounds like an exciting time. And that comment about that one carb reminds me of a guest I had on last year, Felice Jacka, who's an Australian researcher. She leads a centre called the Food and Mood Centre at Deakin University, and she's one of the pioneers of nutritional psychiatry. And she gave me this great insight when I spoke to her, which I'd never really thought about before, is that most of us, when we're thinking about our food choices, think about how they're going to make us look or what they're going to do to our waistline. And when we're making food-based decisions, a lot of these benefits are so far in the future and focused around the way we look, they can often become discouraging. A, because they're too far away, and B, because for some people it's just a lot harder to lose weight, and therefore they give up on healthy eating. But what she said, which I found fascinating, was that within hours of adding this organism to your system, you can feel better. And independent of your body weight, independent of how your genes fit, this can improve not only how you feel, but other mental health related aspects of your life. And I just found that mind blowing. And I just think not enough people know that fact. And we need to share that message.
Yeah, it's an awesome message. And, just add a little bit of complexity to it because, these things are not just your life, it's your parents, grandparents itself. I mean, if the Dutch winter cohort, the children almost starved to death at the end of the Second World War. If they were in the first trimester, boy, they're children have a body that's ready for the world in a different way, is looking for stress, etc. And you can predict things like diabetes based on what your grandfather was eating. So, because you have epigenetic up and down regulation of gene systems that come from these gut biomes that can be passed along. So, it's not just your health and feeling well and how you look, but it's maybe your children's as well, which I like telling people because sometimes people are willing to do a lot for their children or their children's children that they wouldn't do for themselves. And, learning how to be healthy is a human journey that involves not just your life, but the life of all of us, and not just those who are here now, but the ones who are following. So, yeah, time's up. We're going to have to deal with this complexity. And I think modern science has the tools to do it.
Do people have the capacity to change? So let's start talking about these skills, and let's start talking about this concept of psychological flexibility. One of my collaborators, Dr. Paula Robinson, who wrote a research paper on mental fitness back in 2008, has put together 4 elements of mental fitness that she borrowed from physical fitness: flexibility, endurance, strength, and team. Team is human connections. Strength is using your own strengths and noticing them in others. Endurance is a lot of the resilience and physical capacity things. And flexibility is this ability to self-regulate, calm oneself, self-talk and this sort of thing. And I suppose I'll get you to explain this better. But psychological flexibility, if X happens, then this is how I need to respond, is basically a rule of thumb that we pick up over time. Psychological flexibility, on the other hand, is where X happens and we think, which one of 3 options will I go with, A, B, or C? Is that how you'd explain it, or would you explain it differently? And obviously we're going to go into the detail, but at a simple level, I lost my job, therefore my life's over. That's a common reaction that a lot of people will have. Is there a better example that can explain the simplicity of the term flexibility? It might be hard to apply, but how can we actually understand it simply?
I think flexibility, the metaphor of physical flexibility, maybe not as perfectly apt for this use of the word flexibility, because what we're talking about is healthy variation that can be selected and retained that fits the context across these different psychological dimensions and across these different levels. And so the term applies to that entire set of healthy variation, meaning, yeah, as you said, selection among alternatives, not just when you're making an intellectual decision or choice, but even as you're just feeling your way intuitively, when you're playing sport, when you're, talking to someone, you can't really do it on a rule based, what are my alternatives? The moment is gone. But to be able to sort of go with the flow, and that very concept of flow actually is very close to this idea of this healthy variation. But then noticing the winners and losers, you got to have selection criteria. And by the way, you're going to have to practice and integrate the good things that you learn, or you're not going to retain them. And you better keep your eye wide as to what the situation's going on inside and out, because there's nothing, absolutely nothing, that is always positive or always negative. Even some things that look negative sometimes are helpful. And some of the things that are positive will abandon you in particular contexts. So psychological flexibility is applying that healthy patterns of variation, selection, retention that fitted the context across these dimensions I mentioned and these levels I've mentioned. If you do that, life's going to move forward, and you're going to prosper in what we're doing, even though you're going to have ups and downs because you're deploying your full skill set.
So, first of all, we need to accept that these ups and downs are a part of a fully lived life. And back to our first question, we can't be happy all the time. It's both unrealistic and unhelpful. What kind of things do people do or say that are markers of psychological inflexibility?
Well, if you click through the dimensions, they avoid or cling emotionally. They get wrapped around cognitions and narrow their focus way too early. They don't have the ability to broaden or narrow or shift or stay their attentional processes and come into the now. They disappear into rumination and worry. They buy into the stories that their mind's telling about who they are and who other people are, and then they try to defend it instead of tapping into a part of them that's more spiritual and universal and connects you in consciousness to others. They don't pursue their values. Instead, they try to, get the Instagram likes or a whole lot of money or the big car, the big house, or the person who really looks awesome as a date, and miss the capacity for you to choose what's important and put that into your behavior. And they don't deploy their skills of creating habits. And so they lose even the wins that they've had because they fall away and they're not available the next time. So psychological inflexibility is a train wreck. If you want to predict misery in almost any area of human life, if you take a psychological inflexibility measure, it will predict it really quite well. We have data now over 10-year periods with true random samples that are representative of entire populations that are assessed repeatedly with measures to the nines. And if we can show that these this set of behaviors I just specified will lead to anxiety disorders, depression, and all that, will lead to mismanaging your health, will lead to disease, will actually shorten your life. And so time's up. If you really want to live a life that's prosperous, whole, and free, you have to learn how to do it. And your logical problem solving mind won't give you all those answers, because part of what you're going to have to learn to do is how to rein in your logical problem solving mind.
There are a lot of smart people who are rational and analytical and great at solving real world problems. They're successful in their work or in other aspects of their life, but have trouble dealing with their emotions. It doesn't work. They have relationship issues or what have you. In other words, how can a smart, successful, and otherwise skillful person in middle age develop something like burnout or middle age depression by being so inflexible? And how do you reach that person? How does that person go when everything's pretty good? Often you see people when they're struggling in the clinician's chair. But how do we get through to people who are doing fine, but who could, do with an update of their software, so to speak?
That's an awesome question. And we find that, people can have strengths in one area and not have strengths in other areas. I gave a talk, it was a TEDx talk, you can find it online, to kids in the Davidson Academy, where you have to have IQs of 99.9% or above. And I wanted to do it there. And I specifically focused not even just on emotional flexibility and wisdom, but on cognitive flexibility and wisdom, because I know even these brainiacs who are wonderful at solving problems and so forth, when it comes to their own self, they're wagging fingers at themselves, they're buying into the stories their mind gives them. I'll give you another example. Athletes are awesome at being able to deal with openness with regard to physical sensations that would be difficult for you or I. They can push through that barrier that you hit if you're a long distance runner, or that pain that you feel if you're a lineman in football. Yeah, but then when it comes to emotional openness and relationships, those newspaper stories about the great athletes, whacking their spouses and so forth, aren't just a random example. They don't necessarily know how to apply it to the relationship-based emotions. So think of these 6 dimensions that I mentioned as sides of a box. You're one human being, and you have to have strength, flexibility, and endurance. And a part of a group, I'll go with your flexibility, endurance, strength, and team formulation as a way of thinking about it. Across each of those 6 things, it's like 6 sides of a box. If you take a couple of sides out of a box, it's not a box anymore. You can't stand on it, it falls apart. And life will give you the challenge to stand on your psychological flexibility skills, your resilience skills. And if you haven't strengthened all of them, it's going to find that, and you're going to find burnout, etc. Now, you asked the question, how do you motivate? Well, high performers step forward usually with things like a sense of emptiness. Like, what is this all about? I've had all this success and achievement, and I thought I would just be smiling from morning to night. It doesn't feel like that. Relationship problems. I may think I'm grand, but as the more I think I'm grand, actually I find my relationships are going poorly, maybe even more and more poorly. How many successful CEOs and so forth have been through how many divorces? And the reason is that they're not attending to the whole set of skills you need to live that kind of flexible, strong, endurant life. And the psychological flexibility skills, I think, give you a way forward. So we do burnout work with CEOs and high performers and athletes and so forth. And we've watched people win gold medals at the Olympics with ACT coaches. There are some teams that have all ACT all the time. The Toronto Blue Jays, which did a pretty good run last year, the entire team of mental performance coaches were ACT based. So people are waking up to it, that you can create a balanced person if you work on these flexibility skills without saying, oh, you have to achieve less, or oh, your aspiration to have that be that high performant is harming you. That's bull. No, you just have to keep it in balance and strengthen all 6 sides so it's there when you need it.
Let's go through a couple of these elements, and we'll go through them slowly. We'll go through them one by one, and I'll just invite you to comment on a couple of them. So this idea of cognitive diffusion, we often call it thoughts are not facts. We experience the world through our thoughts. The stories we tell ourselves we believe are true. This is not always the case. Talk us through, in plain English, what cognitive diffusion is and how we can step away or step back from our thoughts.
It's the deliberate use of methods that reduce the unwanted automatic dominance of cognition over behavioral regulation, over the choices and decisions that you make, so that a larger range of information and of parts of you can participate in the behavioral choices that you make through your life. I don't mean just the decisions. I don't mean sitting down and make a choice, but just even the intuitive choices that you make moment by moment, that you don't want to just be the cognitive robot, lining up the pros and cons and disappearing from that moment. You need your felt sense, emotions, your sense of interconnection with others and so forth. And to do that, you need to have that skill of stepping back and noticing, being able to notice and describe your thoughts the way you might notice and describe the statements of someone else. I mean, if you had somebody in the back seat saying what was inside your head that you get all wrapped around with, especially if they pay it off as poorly as some of those thoughts do, you'd be, only listening with half an ear. You'd say, "Oh, fine, thank you," just like you do with the kids in the back seat when you're on a long drive. You're not in there trying to solve their arguments, or you're not driving anymore, and you're at risk of driving off the road. You let it kind of go in one way or the other because there's nothing there of importance.
We can come to our thoughts with a sense of curiosity and interest and detachment. I like that. Makes a lot of sense. Can we, once and for all, because we've got a lot of listeners who find this term confusing, the word acceptance. For example, the war in the Ukraine, we have to accept it. Or, a trauma or a sexual assault from earlier in life, or we lost our job or whatever it might be, accepting slavery or this sort of thing. And a lot of people take the everyday use of this term as, well, I like it, I'm okay with it, I won't actually do anything about it. Can you clearly articulate what you mean by acceptance and how that's different to just being meek?
Yeah, in hindsight, should we have picked acceptance? Well, any word you pick, if it's a word that's in normal usage, carries with it connotations that aren't what you mean. Fortunately, something like diffusion doesn't because we made it up. But then people don't know what that means. And, there is a meaning of acceptance that is there in the English language. It's old, it's still there. If you have a precious gift you're going to give somebody, you give it to them and you say, here, would you accept this? You don't mean, will you tolerate it? Will you resign yourself to it? Can you put up with it? No, you mean, will you willingly take it? And when situations show up that are your values and your core says are unhealthy for you, you know, excuse me, I'm not accepting that. And exactly the place in which you ignore your emotions or try to push away your thoughts, or the place in which you do, the place in which you stay in that abusive relationship, or you don't change that job just because it's too scary, even though very likely that's exactly what you need to do. But in the world of emotion, in the world of sensation, acceptance is the place to start, because good, bad, or indifferent, if there's any information there that you can use, you first have to receive the gift that's offered by it. Why am I feeling this way right in this moment? What do I have to learn from it? Nothing? Okay. Why is this sensation happening? What do I have to learn from it? I've tinnitus. You know, the lesson I had to learn from that is, don't be a punk rocker, and when you get older, don't like trance. And by the way, don't stand in front of 60-foot tall, speakers that are putting out sound at higher than the level of, a jet engine. Okay, lesson learned. Next lifetime, I won't do that. But meanwhile, what do I have? I have 24/7 ringing in my ears. Well, I let that thing go all the way up to the point where I caught myself having a suicidal thought. If I'd shoot myself, the sound would go away before it even occurred to me to apply my life's work to it. And then with a long walk, it was 50% better. And a week later, it was 100% better. And, you know, do I hear my ears ringing? I do now. I'm talking about it. But there's no more information there. So my point is that acceptance, the gift that's offered, which we covered earlier in this talk, of emotion and sensation and memory and random thoughts, they're gifts. They tell you how your past is showing up here in the present. It's not to be allowed to dominate you, but if you first can't observe and describe it, you can't receive whatever gift it has to give you. And sometimes it's not much of a gift. It's just a gift of, don't be so stupid next time with your music choices.
Or it can be around just accepting that the problem is. When we fight with reality, we suffer. And we don't have to always say to ourselves, it shouldn't be this way.
Accepting the situation is not what we're talking about. You're an agent. And the very first exposure of ACT, when it hit that, get out of your mind and into your life, beat Harry Potter for one glorious week on the sales pages. Immediately, you're just asking people to accept abuse. Fortunately, the first randomized trial of that era was with call workers in a bank, which is a horrific job. People hate you when you call them because you're trying to get them to pay, etc. And we had a randomized trial where we taught people how to change the stressors at work or how to do ACT. When you do ACT, the stress went down. But here's what was cool. By follow-up, they were challenging changes more than if you actually trained people to challenge the way the work environment was arranged. Why? Because people were playing it small. And instead of going to their foreman and say, look, this is not the way to do this. You're adding stress to my world. Can we do this? That's hard. It's scary. If you don't have that emotional flexibility, that cognitive flexibility, you're not going to have the behavioral flexibility to change the world. I mean, Mother Teresa said she was, frightened to go to the UN. I mean, of course. Do you think it was easy to be Nelson Mandela? And what are you talking about? You have to be able to carry your insides to be able to make a difference in the outsides.
So, speaking of the outside world, a friend of mine was recently telling me about his burnout. He's a medical doctor, but it was brought on by climate anxiety. This is a growing trend, especially amongst young people. Have you come across this concept? What do you think of it? And have you ever thought about how your work can help people deal with a problem that clearly is, but can mean different things depending on how you choose to interpret it? So, how does your work apply to something like the climate catastrophe, as a lot of people might call it?
Well, it does hugely. My first book I ever wrote was called Environmental Problems, Behavioral Solutions, and it was about how we can use psychology to change the environmental world. This is all back in the 1980s, long before when you're looking at somebody with the first Earth Day, all that kind of stuff. And, it was ignored. And here we are, 40 years later, and we're facing the consequences. So we need to mobilize our psychological and our social resources. And we've learned how to scale psychological flexibility into groups and communities. We've had to add a few things to do that. There's a project called Pro-Social. And if you were to come hang out at our convention or something, you'll see multiple talks on environmental justice and climate change. And we're working with people around the world to help create more psychologically flexible individuals put into groups that then step forward for those challenges, because this has to be a we solution. So take that environmental anxiety, and instead of burning out, how about stepping up? How about tuning in? How about aligning with others to do the hard work it's going to take as a human community? It can't be done in any one nation. It has to be all of us. You have to have that world ethic and step forward to this challenge. And we're actively doing it by, for example, making values choices, making public commitments, putting that into what we're doing with our own behavior and the behavior of others, coming together in community with communitarian kinds of efforts that listen to people, don't just tell them what to do, but listen what their concerns are, and invite people in to an exciting journey. We're going to do this. We're going to figure this out, in my opinion. Human beings have step up to that challenge, but cultural change that fast is hard. And we're going to have to go through it in a way that's open, mindful, and values-based. And so ACT is all over it. It's everywhere.
We've sort of skipped ahead to values and committed action there, but I suppose the middle steps there, contact with the present moment, that's mindfulness. We talked to Ellen Langer, which is a very Western scientific approach to mindfulness. Just observe what's happening around you with curiosity, as opposed to, say, your Buddhist inspired approaches that might require meditation. There's different approaches there. The observing self, I like. There's a phrase that I use, and I know that you like using: I'm having the thought that. Can you talk us through that as a way of both diffusing from your thoughts, but also being this bird's eye display on your life that helps you not get as deeply involved in what's going on?
Yeah, I think of all the flexibility processes, this is the one that's most difficult to describe and the most important. It's more central. It's where a lot of things start. It was the first thing I ever wrote about in ACT in 1984 after my night on the carpet. You can see my TEDx talk and see what it was like to hit the bottom of panic disorder, in my case, and have an out-of-body experience that reoriented me from trying to get out and instead trying to get in. And that 180 turn is what ACT then became. And so this more spiritual noticing, witnessing sense of self, this ineffable I hear nowness of awareness, not even awareness of anything, but simply the table of awareness that the content of consciousness contains, connects us to others. I can take the perspective of what it's like to be you with your notes interviewing me. I have a little sense of that. And if I push it a little bit, I can have a much bigger sense of that. I can actually literally maybe see what your screen looks like, and it's different than what my screen looks like, and what your fears, expectations, and hopes for this interview are. Maybe that's a little different than mine, but we can come together in community to do something that's maybe helpful for people who are listening by being able to take that perspective. So this observing sense of self that is not the conceptualized self, the list of attributes, good and bad, that you think you have, nor just the ongoing awareness of this and this and this that's in your environment, both of which are important. Don't get entangled with the conceptualized self. Well, we all got one, and it's fine if you're not entangled with it. But then notice who's noticing. Notice consciousness itself. You can't do it other than a microsecond, because it's the place we look from, not what we look at. It happens more in spiritual experiences, But it's that part that makes us be able to have spiritual experiences where you experience oneness across person or time or place. ACT is actively involved in the psychedelic therapy movement. It's used very often for that purpose. I think we may be able to get this thing dialed in even more. With that, if we do it responsibly, please don't redo the 60s and 70s. I lived that once. I don't want to see it again. I was on Hippie Hill. It was not all what it was said to be. But, we've got to figure out how to put spirituality into the modern world. And it looks like we're not going to be able to do it with traditional religions and churches only. There's, none of the above is the fastest growing religious group.
Mm.
It's soon, it's over a quarter already. It'll soon be half, and it's not going to slow down.
Yeah.
We're going to have to figure out a way to dial in this witnessing, noticing, more spiritual sense of self that connects you in consciousness to others. And it's the one place that you're not threatened by your emotions, you're not threatened by your thoughts. It's okay to fail. You can risk it with values. You can learn by trial and error. You can become competent without having to be instantly, God's gift to whatever it is you want to become. Spirituality is important to people, and if we're not going to find it only in our synagogues or churches or temples, we better find it another way.
Which brings us to values and committed action. Nir Eyal on our podcast said, success is doing what you said you'd do. And, I think when a lot of people think about values, they think about church and whether they steal or not and all this sort of thing. And then more recently, it's become whether you drive a Prius or do you eat meat and these sorts of things. But it's bigger than that. Talk us through about why values are important for our lives, how they impact how we set goals, and almost most importantly, how they impact how we use time.
Wow. Well, as a 74-year-old, that last question is, how do we use time? It becomes very dominant. And as you get older, time shifts and you ask that question more. Values are these chosen qualities of being and doing that are up to you, not up to your wagging fingers of shame and blame or what people want or the applause or the likes on Instagram, but up to you and the person you see in the mirror. What are you up to? And there's 4 ways that I know of to find it. Look at the places where you're hurt, flip it over, you'll find that you care about something. Look at your sweetest moments in a given domain, the things that really vitalize you, lift you up. Wow, that was awesome. You're going to find your values in there. Look at your heroes, the people you look up to, the ones you say, wow, oh man, you're going to find your values there. And then taking responsibility for your life as a story that's being written, where you can't decide the characters or the incidents, but you can decide the theme. And that capacity to write a hero's journey instead of just a tragedy, that's in your hands right now. That moving finger is writ, that famous quote. And so what kind of story are you writing? So sweet, sad, heroes and stories. Look at what your deepest sense of yearning for purpose and meaning tells you about what you want to stand for, who and how you want to be in the world, and put your behavioral effort into that. You can't do it until you're flexible enough on the first things we talked about. Why? Because you're running away from your emotions. You're driven by your automatic thoughts. Some of that was put into your head by others. It's prejudice. It's got cultural stuff in there you loathe. No, your programming is full of stuff you don't like. But your choices, no, almost by definition, you can trust them because it's the whole of you pointing in a direction and saying, I'm going that way.
I love that thing about the hero's journey. What's that, Joseph Campbell? And I suppose to anyone who's listening now and you're in the middle of this big, deep problem, I think Stephen might have just described a way that might make it a little bit easier to take. And that is, you're at that point 3/4 of the way through a movie where you've had the character introduced, he's met the girl and he's met the enemy, but then that big bad thing happens. And that's where you're at right now. And that's a way of almost diffusing, isn't it, from your thoughts? As, hang on, I'm stepping back, I'm observing my story here. And that's what I love about the Stoics, because no matter what happens, they say, I get to author that story and I get to suffer well here and I can show character here. And it's very different to the modern conception of happiness where, well, I need things to be going my way to be happy. I can be happy by dealing with this problem well. And that has been one of the most inspiring learnings of my life.
Yeah, that thing of because they're going my way, you know you're standing on sand. Suppose you get hit by a truck tomorrow. Suppose your handsome self becomes permanently ugly tomorrow. What are you going to do with that? You're going to write a hero's journey about that? That's a choice. You can do that. But if you have that happy, happy, joy, joy kind of vision of happiness, which is really not happiness, it's gone. Do you think your mind didn't know that? It didn't know how vulnerable you are? Oh, the reason it's rigid is it's trying to protect you from information about how, weak that is, not strong. If you want to be strong, confident, what does that mean? With fidence, what is that? Faith, with fidelity to yourself. Well, what is the fidelity that you most yearn for? What you want to be. That's the hero's journey. The Joseph Campbell thing, you could think of the flexibility processes as that. You're in this one sense of self, you're given a challenge. It shows up somehow out of the world. You're saying, "Who me? I'm not adequate to it." And you're facing your fears, You say, "I'm not afraid." Yoda says, "You will be. You're going to have to face your fears to do that Star Wars thing, Luke." And finally, you come into the present moment now with your values, align with your friends. You take charge against this sea of troubles and you do the heroic thing. And whether that's stepping up to the fact that you got hit by a car yesterday, or you got a cancer diagnosis, or your wife has decided to divorce you, or whatever it is, that's the way the hero's journey is played out. So I think you could summarize all of our great art, literature, etc., around the attempt of wiser folks in the past to teach us these kind of flexibility skills in the stories that they tell, in the music and dance that they create, in the pictures that they paint.
But yet we don't do it. And you mention cars there, and I've heard you use a metaphor of a fast sports car to describe the way we put the accelerator down on our thoughts and these cognitions and these negative stories, these unexamined stories, rather than the brakes. Can you talk us through that metaphor of how we can slow down our minds to deal with chronic stress?
Well, we've invented as a human species an enormous engine. I mean, my goodness, look what we're doing right now, dude. We're talking across thousands of miles in real time. And it's going to be put up on the internet, and everybody around the world can access it. Can you imagine that? No, just even 10, 20 years ago, you couldn't even imagine it. And here it is. And it's not stopping, it's accelerating because we've been able to take this engine, this amazing cognitive ability where you literally have more thoughts in your head, and I can show you the math, and there are molecules in the universe, and be able to do things for good. But if you don't learn how to manage that, it's an empty promise because you see at the very same time that this enormous expansion is happening, that there's been a five-fold increase in suicide in 10 to 12-year-olds over the last 10 years. And this is not just people saying, no, these are dead bodies, dude. Don't be telling me it's just getting comfortable talking about pain. It is not. Children are dying. Something's wrong. And they're not dying in the middle of the war zone only. They're dying, in the midst of plenty. How would that happen? Well, I think we know how that happens. And so putting on the brakes, what I meant by that was not slowing down to no longer pursue valid goals. I mean, taking that power and being able to direct it in a way that has a steering wheel on it, has a brake pedal on it. And what would the brake pedal be? Well, for example, your mind tells you, "I'm going to have to work from morning to night to get this thing to happen." Okay, well, it's physically unhealthy. Your relationships are going to suffer. What the heck is this really for? Is this some ego trip? What, you're going to post it on the internet? That's how many wonderful things you did. What is that really what you want to be about? What happens when you're no longer looked at? What happens when the applause is not there? What happens when that athletic career ends? What happens when, you know, you better be ready for the whole range of things. So you put on the brakes in the sense of having the ability to use your awesome power of creation and possibility and contribution, regulated by the choices that you make about the kind of life you want to live and the kind of person you want to be, and giving as much attention to your psychological health, your physical health, as you do to achievement or other things that this organ between your ears can give you. And to do that, you're going to have to rein in the organism between your ears. You can't just shove down the accelerator because it's only one part of you. This evolutionarily recent thing is only a couple 100,000 to 2.8 million years old. You've got learning processes in you that are 500,000,000 years old. You've got features of your system that go hundreds of million years before that. So, you can't treat yourself as if you're just a brain in a bottle.
Yeah.
You're not. You're a whole person, and find a way to be all of that.
Yeah. We're coming to the end of our discussion. A couple more questions I want to ask you. What are you most proud of in your work, in your research? Is there an anecdote of the impact that you've had that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, if I had to pick my single most, wow, that's pretty cool moment, it happened recently with the World Health Organization. They came to me and asked for 8 years ago for some help with people who had been through of war. And at the time, they were especially focused at the war in the South Sudan. And I said, that's awesome. Why did they come to me? Because I'd spent 40 years trying to figure out how to come up with an approach that's so transdiagnostic. It's not even transdiagnostic. I mean, I'm not really caring about those syndromes. I care about mental health, but also behavioral health, social wellness, and justice. And they came to me with that. I sent them to one of the best, a guy named Russ Harris, who's awesome at translating.
Australian guy.
He absolutely is. And he is really good at translating some of these complex ideas in ways that people can understand. This geek is sometimes not so good at that. And he came up with a cartoon book because it was going to be done with illiterate populations, and an audio tape that could be delivered to people literally sitting in dirt with nothing but their lives and maybe their children and clothes. That's it. And WHO went through, World Health Organization went through 3 big randomized trials, and they've continued doing it. Why? Because when they've proven it 3 times, then they're willing to put it on their website. So they now have, it's the only fully scalable psychological method they have. They made an exception when COVID hit because they didn't have randomized trials on how to help with the stress of COVID. They gave a link to this. Why? Because if you go to the website, WHO says this is good for anything that distresses anyone in any circumstance. Literally, almost word for word. And it's being deployed right now in the Ukraine. It was deployed with the Syrian refugees in Turkey. What does it do? Forward in mental health, that's as big as you get as self-help in the developed world among the privileged. It reduces the development, if you're not yet there, of mental health disorders by 50%. And it works by psychological flexibility with a study that's under review now, but I'm sure will be out very, very soon. And I look at that and I say, okay, 40 years of work. The World Health Organization is distributing ACT self-help in 22 different languages and putting it into countries around the world to help with people who are suffering because of war. That's a pretty good job, Steve. Even though it's not me, it's a community. And it took 40 years of an entire community, but I am proud of it.
Great. So after 40 years, what is next for Professor Stephen Hayes?
Boy, do I have a big task ahead of me. In the course of figuring out that processes of change matter and should really be the focus, and trying to develop a whole new model of evidence-based therapy we're calling process-based therapy, I discovered that the physicists knew 140 years ago and proved 90 years ago what the psychologists are only catching up to, which is that Galton's bell curves and standard deviations cannot mathematically predict the trajectory of individuals. And then I dig into why are these statistical tools used so broadly? And I discover they were developed for eugenics.
Can you go back over what you just said and explain that in a simpler fashion for our audience?
There's a dirty history of the concepts that we apply at the kitchen table when we say, oh, that's not normal, or my kid got into the gifted and talented class, or oh, you got a cancer diagnosis, or oh, you got major depression, or I'm bipolar, or my IQ is 120, or it's so much in our blood now, 150 years after Galton's standard deviations, that came in a book called Hereditary Genius, where he tried to argue that we were de-evolving because the upper white groups in the UK weren't breeding enough in the lower classes, where it's a racist diatribe. And he established the first department of eugenics. And so, what I've discovered, to my horror, is that 95% of the tools we're using in mainstream behavioral science had this contaminated history. It's been suppressed and forgotten about. Started in the US of A more than anyone. Don't be thinking just Germany. Germany copied the laws of Virginia to set up the laws that eventually led to the Holocaust. But even before the Holocaust, killing people who had mental health problems. Nurses literally injecting them with poison each night and would get a list of who would die. And so your mental hospitals had 15,000 people dying in this hospital, or 20,000 in that, before what we call the Holocaust. It was part of the Holocaust. So I'm digging into this and I'm getting madder and madder. And what's ahead of me is it's time to kill the DSM. It's a time to stop with the IQ tests and start focusing on what empowers people. Time to stop categorizing people on differences between people and start empowering people on the things within their lives that will help them become more resilient and successful. That requires a complete change in our science. And fortunately, the tools are here and we're inventing them, we're using them statistically and in terms of measures, and they're massively different than what the mainstream is doing. So, my last years are going to be controversial and very interesting, because I've got some hard truths to put in front of my field.
That's going to be very interesting. Do you believe that a diagnosis of major depression or anxiety disorder as a label helps to explain? Um, does it help a person to explain why they may be experiencing a certain way? It sounds like so. On the one hand, someone who might be experiencing depression, for example, cannot understand why they can't feel anything at all, or why they're sad when others are not, or very sad when others are not, or whatever it might be. And a label comes along, you have major depression. On the one hand, it's very stigmatized, and so the person has to live with that. But on the other hand, it's a explanation. Is the explanation helping or is it not?
On balance, it's not helpful, but it is destigmatizing in a sense. You finally have an understanding, got a name for it, etc. But you also immediately start foreshortening your futures. So does your family. You're much more likely to go on high dosage, long-term medications that have a whole train wreck of side effects and so forth, the opponent process effects and so forth. That not that medications can't ever be used, they should be, but shorter term and linked to the psychosocial things that we know long term are needed. The part that I get most upset about is that it doesn't tell you what to do.
Mm.
It tells you who you are, supposedly. But I'm back to the fact that physics is known, the theory is called the ergodic theorem, that you can't go from a collective to predicting the behavior of elements of a collective over time unless the phenomena don't change and they're all identical. So if we're treating frozen clones, we should be happy, but we're not. And take major depression. The STAR-D trial, huge randomized trial, 3,700 people. How many different collections of signs and symptoms? More than 1,000. How many people had a collection that was so weird, so idiosyncratic, so atypical that it only applied to 1/100th of 1% of the entire population? Almost half. This is not a diagnostic system. It's a joke. And it's a bad joke because it doesn't tell you how you got entangled with sadness, how you socially withdraw. But there are methods that will do that. And we're now showing in our research how each of those persons have different constellations of processes of change that lead to that outcome. Why would that matter? Because then I can say to you, just the way I would with personalized medicine, if you had a cancer diagnosis or whatever, that we've looked individually at you and how you're managing your life and what your biophysiology are, social cultural factors too, maybe even the gut biome. We just need the data to put it into these new statistical means where I can say, you need this and this and this and this. It's not one size fits all. It's this size fits you. And we can get there in psychotherapy and in even the use of medications for psychological problems. But we'll never get there with this top down categorical normative stuff that came from Galton's eugenic dreams.
That is really, really interesting. And I suppose the earlier we can do this in people's journeys in life and bring this into schools and equip them with these skills as early as possible, we may be able to help some people avoid the crater. And, at the very worst, they fall into a ditch. Much easier to get out of a ditch than it is a crater.
That goes back to something we said earlier. Learn these flexibility skills along the way, the things that are important to you, so they're there when things that are even more challenging show up. And I'm excited about what you're saying. I'm now, as I'm retiring, I'll be retired by the end of this June, president of a charitable organization that is developing an app that will do exactly that, of high density longitudinal measurements of you, where you can just say what's going on in your life repeatedly for about 5 weeks. And then we'll model, not on the basis of some category that someone else has, but on what happens in your life. What empowers you and what disempowers you? And how can we deploy these empowerment processes more in your life? What do you need to learn to be able to perturbate this network that's drawing you down into one that will push you up and evolve on purpose? So I'm so excited. I wish I was a younger person so I could pursue it longer, but I know this is important, and it is a continuity of the ACT journey of trying to distill down to the smallest set of things that do the most good. But we have so much more to do to be able to put that into individuals' lives, rather than just saying something like, "Hey, learn ACT." Nah, that's more of the same too. No, what specifically do you need?
Well, that's what drives us at Resilient Agenda. This idea of, this is your lifelong journey, your mental fitness skills. What do you need to be fit for today and tomorrow? What do people in general need to be fit for? But what do you need to be fit for? We call that person activity fit. And that's my life's work. And I hope to learn from you as you keep contributing into your retirement, Steve.
And can I say one thing? I know we're getting to the end, but we went back and looked, my colleagues and I are interested in this, at every single randomized trial ever done in the history of the universe focused on a mental health outcome that used a psychosocial method and claimed to have identified the functionally important pathway of change through a thing that's called mediational analysis, which is the statistics that people agree you should apply. We looked at every single one, took 3 years, 55,000 studies, took a crew of 50 to do it. And we now can say, if you look at the replicated findings, more than half of everything we know about how change happens fits what I've been talking to you about today. More than half. And it's not because more than half of the randomized trials are ACT. It's because all along, in plain sight, we've been learning how to evolve on purpose by modifying processes that matter. And these flexibility processes and mindfulness processes and the things that are close allies, the self-compassion, behavioral activation, cognitive flexibility, when you get a little more friendly, and even adding in things, like self-efficacy, believing in yourself, I can do something, etc., that percentage goes up to almost 90%. So we know what people need to do. It's not the final answer. Of course, new things will be found, but we know a lot of what will empower individual human lives. Time's up. Time for us to focus on it, put it into our systems, our business, our schools, and into our psychotherapy and into self-help in our hearts and minds and hands. And why? Because it will make a difference in your life.
Do you believe in your heart of hearts that skill set and that direction can counterweigh or outweigh the force of circumstance, the distraction from social media, the unfortunate aspects of individualism and consumer capitalism, values that people have had for millions of years, get rich, exploit, all these sorts of things that, if you look at them in different ways, aren't always bad, but can be. Do you think we are keeping up with the forces of change from this skill set level? It doesn't sound like we are.
Not alone. We have to do it in community. And the larger message, if you believe we're going to evolve on purpose, let's really start with a model of the human being that's right. The invisible hand, greed is good, or top-down command and control are both abject failures. There is a third way. Lynn Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in economics as a political scientist in 2009 for a reason. And the economists said, who? No, because Lynn Ostrom showed that indigenous peoples have been coming together in ways that fit evolutionary theory and managing their resources, their common pool resources, their forests, their lakes, their fisheries, their stream, perfectly well without government control or private ownership. We can build a model of how to step up to our challenges that are closer to what we know human beings are. You are not inherently selfish. Greed is not good, but you have to create a social environment in which it's safe to care and to trust and to cooperate. And if we use modern evolutionary theory, modern psychological theory, I'm talking about it right now. Go to the WHO thing, you'll be able to see some of what those skills are for free. Download it and check it out, and then begin to put it into communities and focused on all these issues. Do I believe in humanity's capacity to manage change? You betcha. I do believe in that. But is that going to be hard? And is it all hands on deck? And are we going to make a lot of mistakes? Yeah, we've made a bunch of them. And some of them can become very threatening to us, and what we're seeing with climate change. I mean, I wrote that book almost 40 years ago, and I wasn't the only one saying where we're going to go. And here we are, far worse off because we didn't step up to it. That doesn't mean that we can't evolve a cultural wisdom that can use the best of behavioral and physical science along with the best of our wisdom traditions and create the kind of communities and individuals that can step up to that challenge. Let's get busy.
Yeah. Other than your books, which we're going to put links to in the show notes, are there any other books that, based on what we've talked about today, or that have had a big impact in your life that you really love? The one that comes to mind that seems similar is Susan David's Emotional Agility. But is there anything that you love or recommend people read? Anything by Russ Harris or anyone like that?
Well, yeah, Emotional Agility came out of ACT. It's there in the foreword. So, yeah, of course, that's a fellow traveler. It's just a business offshoot of the same core work. I like reading in a modern, multidimensional, multi-level evolutionary theory because I think it has a lot of wisdom. And so things like Evolution for Everyone, David Sloan Wilson's book, is an awesome way to start. Just begin to think about your life as evolving on purpose and your communities the same way. And so I'll leave it with that one as one that's real important. I'll tell you, the reason I'm a psychologist is I read Walden 2, which is B.F. Skinner's view of could we come up with principles that were good enough that they could tell us how to raise kids, how to have, a satisfying life and so forth. And I've been on a journey to try to help make that happen as an old hippie and a person living on a commune. There's a lot of wisdom around us right now, and I see it in the mindfulness work and the Thich Nhat Hanhs of the world and so forth. But we need to put it out into the world in a new way, and I think the modern extended evolutionary synthesis is the horse I'm betting on.
Wonderful. How can our listeners learn more about you and your work? Where can they go and visit? What should they look at first?
If you want to get my newsletter, I don't spam people. It's a one-click opt-out. Just go to the website by my names, StephenCHayes.com, Stephen with a V, middle initial C. If you want to sort of explore psychological flexibility and ACT, just Google it, and you're going to find supportive groups you can be part of, books that you can read. We've done randomized trials. The very first big ALK self-help book, the one Get Out of Your Mind Into Your Life that you mentioned, when we do randomized trials of that, it does about 2/3 of what a course of psychotherapy does. So that's not bad. And then you can get it for just a cost of a few cups of coffee if you buy it at those expensive coffee places. Yeah, that would be the ways to connect into the work and recognize that there's a community around you. Now, if you need a therapist, if you go to contextualscience.org, that's the main ACT Society, 9,000 people around the world, chapters in 21 different languages. And they have a list of about 5,000 therapists that you can explore. A lot of them do virtual work as well. So you can get help if something I'm saying resonates, but you need professional help and beyond self-help. That's where to go.
Wonderful. Look, I've really enjoyed the discussion. I hope you have too. thank you very much for coming on Resilience Agenda Radio.
It was awesome. Thank you so much for the great question.
Thanks for listening to Resilience Agenda Radio, the mental fitness podcast with me, Hadley Fisher. If you enjoyed today's episode, we invite you to subscribe on your favourite podcasting platform so you'll never miss an update. If you'd like to know more about Resilience Agenda or mental fitness, jump on over to www.resilienceagenda.com. There, you can learn more about our other guests and pick up the show notes from today's episode. You'll learn more about our story, the Mental Fitness Toolkit, and discover our best-selling mental fitness diaries, jam-packed with dozens of strategies and ideas for how you can improve your mental fitness each and every day of the year. Over 25,000 people every year use our diaries to plan time for their own mental fitness or as unique and meaningful gifts for family, friends, and colleagues. That's it for today. We look forward to you joining us next time. Thanks for listening to Resilience Agenda Radio, the mental fitness podcast with me, Hadley Fisher. If you enjoyed today's episode, we invite you to subscribe on your favourite podcasting platform so you'll never miss an update. If you'd like to know more about Resilience Agenda or mental fitness, jump on over to www.resilienceagenda.com. There, you can learn more about our other guests and pick up the show notes from today's episode. You'll learn more about our story, the Mental Fitness Toolkit, and discover our best-selling mental fitness diaries, jam-packed with dozens of strategies and ideas for how you can improve your mental fitness each and every day of the year. Over 25,000 people every year use our diaries to plan time for their own mental fitness or as unique and meaningful gifts for family, friends, and colleagues. That's it for today. We look forward to you joining us next time.